Hello, friends. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. I'm Lee C. Camp. This is our unabridged interview with Joy Harjo. Years ago, I remember with the onslaught of a new war in the Middle East, feeling particularly weighty with that news, biking one day in South Nashville, and I came upon a weeping willow tree, and I experienced it as a sort of theological encounter. That is, it was a sort of reminder that, yes, God has wept many tears over the violence of the creation, and yes, you in your own day must continue to bear the weight of violence in your own day and find some sort of constructive way forward. And yet we in our own day, not only do we continue to deal with the onslaught of war far and near, but at the same time, so much concern about climate devastation, about the ongoing threats potentially of AI and technology, not knowing yet what it will leave in its wake. And so we hear from folks. You talk a lot on No Small Endeavor about exploring what it means to live a good life, but what does it mean to live a good life in the midst of such challenges as these? As the team and I were discussing these sorts of questions one day, we remembered the line from Chris Wyman's memoir, My Bright Abyss. Chris has been on the show a few times, a wonderful poet himself, and he asked the question, in the midst of war, in the midst of climate devastation, in the midst of all of the things that we face and struggle with, what is poetry's role when the world is burning? Moreover, what is poetry's role when we, who have relative privilege, refuse to give up our privilege and hold on to our privilege in the midst of those who do not have such power and possibilities? This seemed to be a fascinating question to be raised, and so we asked the question, what would it look like if we were to ask that question of three very esteemed poets in our own day? So this is part one of a three-part series asking three poets, what is poetry's role when the world is burning? Today, part one of the three-part series, you'll hear from Joy Harjo. Joy is of Muscogee Creek heritage. She's a three-time U.S. Poet Laureate, and this is a lovely, beautiful conversation with Joy. The second poet that you'll hear from, Haile Liza Ghafouri. Haile is a translator of the Sufi mystic poet Rumi. And third, you'll hear Pádraig Tuama. Pádraig is an Irish poet, peacemaker, theologian. You've heard him before, perhaps, on No Small Endeavor. And all three of these are beautiful, lovely conversations that we hope will give you some sort of encouragement and some sort of nourishment in the days in which we find ourselves. Again, here's part one with Joy Harjo. Enjoy. Our guest today is Joy Harjo, distinguished poet, musician, and three-term U.S. Poet Laureate, the second poet in history to hold this prestigious role for a third term. Joy is a member of the Muscogee Creek Nation, and much of her work draws on First Nation storytelling and histories. Her extensive literary achievements include 10 celebrated poetry collections, notably Conflict Resolution for Holy Beings, shortlisted for the Griffin Prize, and in Mad Love and War, winner of an American Book Award. Joy has been inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame and awarded a National Humanities Medal. Joy, we're very honored to have you with us today.
Well, it's good to be here.
Thank you so much for your time. We're delighted to have you as a part of a series that we're doing, a three-part series with poets. And the premise for this series was set up by our friend and poet Chris Wyman, who in his memoir entitled My Bright Abyss, he asks the question, what is poetry's role when the world is burning? And then he goes on and points to environmental disaster, relentless war, and the paralyzing effect that has on poetry, on us all, that culturally we seem to thrive on death, and that in the midst of all of that, not knowing how to disentangle ourselves from all of that, he asks this question, what is poetry's role when the world is burning? So how might you begin to formulate an answer perhaps to that role of how you think of your work as a poet, helping us, giving us a response to the challenging times in which we find ourselves?
That's my whole next book of poetry.
Well, it's good timing then.
Well, maybe the world is always burning. I'm thinking, I think certainly right now we're at quite a crisis of a magnitude I don't know. I think of Krakatoa and that eruption and this, that, and the other, plague and all those things, and dictators that rise up and fall down. But we're in quite we're in quite a mess right now. I mean, when I'm with Native people, we say, well, we've been through this before and we'll still be here after. But I think the work of poets, I mean, you think about, how is the world constructed and what kind of world are we in of where there appears to be, I mean, we seem to be okay, and then here comes hatred, and here comes dictators, and here comes, this onrush of struggle and suffering, and famine. And, I don't know, poets, philosophers, people fixing cars, whatever, we all, think about, why are we here? What do we, what does it mean? And poetry, and when we construct this world essentially certainly with our dreams, and our dreams get formulated into our thoughts, and our thoughts into action and words, and to words, maybe to words first, or to thoughts, words, and then into action. And poetry demands another kind of language. It's a language. It's not everyday language. It's language that it's ceremonial language of ritual, language that kind of not just taps you on the shoulder, but maybe taps on your heart or at the edge of your soul and says, okay, let's pay attention here. Maybe, in metaphor, a butterfly can be time, or, it shifts, it shifts us into deeper, I don't want to say higher because that's kind of a hierarchical thing, but a deeper perceptions of connection. That's what I would think, is into deeper perceptions of connection. And so the role of poets is to we're witness, all of us are witness to history, but poets kind of bring that to a refined and tough language, to the attention, to the oral, A-U-R-A-L, to the oral attention of the people, because, it's resonance. Language is sound, it's resonance.
You've spoken about how this is very personal for you. At one point you said, in a strange kind of sense, writing frees me to believe in myself, to be able to speak, to have voice, because I have to. It is my survival. What's that looked like for you, for your writing, your poetry to be your survival?
I don't know. I don't know when I said that. That was probably a little ways back.
Does that still resonate with you any?
Yes, but it resonates more, like, I think more of, it's not my necessarily in the personal sense, but it's how I think when I first began writing as part of Native rights movements. I had no plan to become a poet or a writer. I was into making images. I was when I started writing poetry, I was a studio art major and involved in Native rights movements. And it seemed like the shift, I didn't do it consciously and say, well, I'm going to be a poet now. I started writing out of, after hearing these eloquent speeches and responses to community people being questioned by, like Kennecott copper, companies, copper, extraction, companies of extraction who were going on to native lands in the Southwest, not far from Albuquerque in New Mexico, and the native communities would call in native students because we were getting educated just to witness or to listen or to help. And to hear those people speak and how they made connections between the land, between history and what being a human being meant to them, and how it was connected, inspired me or just took hold in me and I started writing poetry out of that impetus. So my work came about out of a need for healing. I mean, justice is part of that. Justice for anyone is, it's that becomes a kind of healing.
You, elsewhere, I read that you said the importance of you becoming a student at the University of New Mexico had been very significant, that you began to understand how much language, putting together words, can make a difference in terms of transformation of nations, transformation of lives, and so on. What do you remember about that moment in which you began to see the power of words in that way?
It was hearing native poets for the first time. I mean, I grew up in Tulsa, and we could see the work of native artists everywhere, and including like my aunt, whose painting is behind me, Aunt Lois Harjo, and others in the community. I mean, we were aware. We knew the artists, knew their names, but poetry was something else. The poetry at school was teachers were terrified of it. It was, they approached it, as something they had to do. And it wasn't, I think if I put myself back again as a student, in 8th grade or 6th grade, and the teacher said, okay, here are songs on paper. Let's listen to them. And then if they read them, that would have been so much more magical than saying, okay, we're going to have we have to do this. We're mandated by the state to do this section on poetry. So I'm going to labor through it and get through it as quick as I can, but to think of it as writing songs on paper would have been magical. And but we didn't read native poets. Even in state history, we all had a required Oklahoma state history. Native history was only like the first few paragraphs, and yet it's everything here in this state. So anyway, so I began hearing native poets. I think the first native poet I met was Simon Ortiz from Acoma Pueblo, and what struck me was that he wrote poems that were about our lives and in the cadence of the English that we spoke in our contemporary young, native communities. Although he was older, he was a kind of a different generation than me. But that opened the door. Leslie Silko, who I knew as she was writing her novel Ceremony when I first met her. She was living in Alaska and came to visit. And we became close and had quite a correspondence for a while. But her poetry, she was a wonderful poet as well as short story writer and novelist. But that poetry was in her novels, just like, Toni Morrison, one of the finest novelists of our time. Her novels are poetry. I mean, there's an attention to language. But and Jim Welch, Blackfoot writer, who is known for his novels, but he wrote one of the best American books of poetry called Riding the Earth Boy 40. And when I heard them, and then I was going through these experiences as a young Native woman and as being part of different gatherings of people telling stories and organizing, that I started writing poetry.
You mentioned that in your state-mandated Oklahoma history, there was very little attention given to Native poets or Native history. Were you aware as a child of much of that history or much of that overlooked history or that literary tradition, or was this something that you only came to learn as you began hearing these poets in this time in college?
When I was growing up, well, my father was Muscogee Creek, and my mother was Cherokee. I don't know how much. She grew up, her mother grew up in a Cherokee family, but they were not enrolled. And but what I grew up hearing, I think from both of them, was Native history. And my father especially was very pronounced in his pride and in his, his family. He comes from quite a historically important family. And so I would hear some of that. And, but later I found out that we're related to Alexander Posey, a major American poet who is also Muscogee Creek, distantly related.
Yeah.
And so, but yeah, I think that, but I didn't know as much as I know. I went digging around. I think it was a different age then. My father was born in 1930. And that was, I think of it as an age of chaos, but especially for Native communities coming out of removal, in the 1800s and trying to reconstruct and everything that went on. And it was our generation that brought everything up again and began organizing about injustices. But it was very clear to my father about the injustices going on, and it was heartbreaking. I think that's what he died of more than anything, was a broken heart. But he was still rowdy.
You've written in your book Crazy Brave about some of the struggles of your father, and about his alcoholism. And how do you see his alcoholism related to that kind of broken heart that you just discussed?
Well, what I like, and I can't remember who said it, but years ago, some of us were sitting around, younger Native people, with an older person, and that person said, we were talking about addiction and alcohol, which is, it affects everybody, but not just Natives. But he was saying, well, people are just looking for a vision. And that's always stayed with me, is that there is that nice little buzz at first that everybody kind of wants to ride, and then it feels good, and then the thought of going back into the real world gets a little bit difficult. I can read a new poem, actually.
Yeah, please.
It was just in the New Yorker. It'll be in the new book. And I had it pulled right up here. It's called Overwhelm. I'll just read it.
Please.
Overwhelm. There was a door between the men arguing and me, in the small town hotel where I returned late to my room. Then they went quiet, which can be more dangerous. I became stealthy in my mind. Bad spirits find doorways in stupor. I used to seek lift from the overwhelm and drink. I'd ride over the meadow of doubt flowers to the field of miracles where anything was possible in the blur. I never drank alone. It was the circle that drew me from the haunting to the waters. We remembered songs that we thought we had forgotten, and we were beautiful beyond belief. The profane danced wildly with the sublime. How ridiculous now to think we were happy in the quick shelter we sought from truth. I now understand how a whole country can drink from the waters of illusion and go down, and how easy fury can turn to gunshots, then give way to torpor. I needed a respite from the story, then as in now. I counted the steps from midnight to home, to your arms. The dark skies of eternity were lit with small fires. They showed me the way.
Thank you for that. As you think about that vision of escape from the torpor that you described there, and earlier you used the language of the tragedies of history and that they were heartbreaking. What are specific ways that historical drama, trauma impacted your own childhood, say? What did that look like on a day-to-day basis, or did it look like anything in particular on a day-to-day basis, or was it something that you came only to learn in time that it was systemic or structural, or what specifically did that mean and look like for you?
I think as a kid, you're just a kid.
Mm.
And your world, you assume that, that's just how people live. Like any kid. I think the perspective starts widening, or it can. It depends. It depends on your mindset, but, from child, it's natural. There's the perspective of infancy, which could be of eternity, more than we think, because we're fresh from that doorway, to the perspective when you're around 7 and you move out into the larger world and you start to see other circles of community and you make your own community with friends.
Mm.
And that's where I think that's when you start realizing, I'm Native, or, this is this and this is that. And then you start you start, sometimes you torque yourself into ways to fit, or you get edgy in your ways of not fitting.
Mm.
And then when you reach adolescence, it's at a fever, this fever of perception. And I have a new book out in October called Girl Warrior. They're coming of age stories. And in one of the stories, I talk about adolescence. I talk about how there's a chrysalis period, and it can be, adolescence is case in point. You go from being a boy to a man, or, you go from being a young person to an adult. And that's quite a process. And I liken it to being in a chrysalis and going from being a caterpillar to a butterfly. And yet how we are in that now, perhaps as a country. We're in the gooey moment of chaotic, where you're no longer a caterpillar, but you're not a butterfly yet. And you don't know how it might happen or what's going to happen. And so I think too, as a kid, you're just moving along. You move through time differently. When you get to my age, there's a huge shift. I love the perspective from here. It gives me a better sense, and a sense to know that it's very difficult to walk through these days because of the terrible, the lack of. We're learning how important leadership is. That's one of the things. If you have a leader, and I've watched this within different universities. I've taught different departments, and the difference between having a leader who brings people together versus somebody who's in it for their own power or doesn't know the basics of leadership. And even in our own lives, are we the leadership in our lives? Or are we, at the, craziness because of somebody makes us feel this way and somebody makes us feel this way? So as a child growing up, certainly the history was there. There was the race riots that had happened in Tulsa. There was a lot of segregation. The world was black and white and Native. My community was mostly Native and white, but there was a little bit of overlap. Now there's all kinds of. There's Hmong community. There's, huge Mexican American community. There's all kinds of communities that we didn't have when I was growing up, and they were there, but I didn't really know about the race riot. I didn't really understand how we wound up there from Georgia or Alabama. There were realities that we crossed into. And then the word was in our, in the schools, it was all, America and, white America. We didn't read black writers either. We didn't read we read mostly writers from England or from the Northeast. My idea of a poet was a old white guy declaiming in a raincoat. Even though there was Emily Dickinson, but even she was in a raincoat, in a country far away, or there were daffodils in a field, or, it had nothing to do with me or my history or how poetry comes from history and place. And then I came to love Yeats, but not through what anybody was teaching in school, in my education. My mother loved poetry, but I came to poetry really through music, through song lyrics. And, but then I think now of, I think I would like to think that what was happening is the students were beginning to see that all of America, there's poets, all of us, all the cultures and their various streams of identity. We had become present in the classroom in a way that was not when I was a student in the 50s and then the early 60s. And then now it's within a few flicks of the wrist of a crazy man. It's undone by one person. By one person. I mean, he has support, obviously, but no one is minding the store, so to speak. Or,
Yeah. I understand that this history you learn later, perhaps. I'd be interested to hear the timeline, but I understand that you discovered that there's a complexity about your own story in that your father was raised with a lot of wealth, and maybe it was your grandfather, great-great-grandfather, who owned the Harjo oil company, and that your father had actually been raised in a 21-room house.
Yeah.
But you'd only learn this later. So what was that like, that discovery like, and how did you make sense of that?
Well, being Native, I mean, we've been so equated with the trauma story, or that all Natives are poor.
Yeah.
Or all Natives are this. Our stories are complex. Someone reminded of a story they used to call her Creek Mary, who in the 1700s, a Muscogee woman who garnered a lot of power by marrying a trader and also garnering a lot of trade and being an asset to her community by, in a way, being a kind of a diplomat, and a major force in the trade economy, which was what was primary in the Southeast at that time. It didn't surprise me. I mean, I knew that there had been oil money, but it didn't make it that. There's a story, and I've been collecting research on that about, we've heard, of course, in a very big way culturally about the Osage and their story, but we have, the Muscogee people have a story too. Same thing with the oil companies going in. I think there's a film coming out about a woman who was one of the wealthiest women in the country, Muscogee woman, or Muscogee and black, and what happened to that money and what they did to her. Because they would come in and kill off parents to gain guardianship. There's all those kinds of stories. So that my grandparents survived that. I mean, my great-grandfather became quite he was principal chief, an interim principal chief, but he was very respected for his, what I get is a kind of humbleness in his take and his studiedness on what was going on in our community, say in the 20s and the early 1900s, and was quite a respected person. And but yeah, he had the first car, and I just found out recently he had our Harjo oil company. And I wonder what happened to that. And other family members were sharecroppers, on my mother's side. It's I had my grandmother, who was a painter, also played saxophone in Indian Territory. I always say, put that in your images of Native people. I mean, we run the gamut. There's, in terms of experience, it's different. Our story as Muscogee people as a whole is very different than, say, the Lakota and Pine Ridge, which, gets presented as the primary story of Native people. But we're not all Plains people. Our music, our culture is different. Like Pacific Northwest people, very different. You're dealing with water. Other ways of, getting food, a lot of salmon, et cetera. I mean, that all makes a difference for any community, not just anthropological studies of natives, but it works the same for, Jewish New York City, what you eat, how you get, how you bring food to the table.
Yeah.
That's, culture.
A moment ago, you spoke of companies of extraction, and which, of course, is kind of classic colonialism. And I'd love to hear you share a little bit with us about how you began. I think in your book, In Mad Love and War, you began to think about those sorts of themes. But how do you frame? How have you begun to process this sort of systemic reality of colonialism and the sorts of ways that such power can wield such devastation in its wake?
How does anybody process it? Really,
Yeah.
I mean, it's really come to bear with this current administration allowing extraction and public lands and protected lands, and it makes me think. I can remember hearing old people who were probably my age then saying, they're not going to stop until they take everything. But we'll still be here. And yet, I just don't want to believe. I can't. I have children, grandchildren. They're all our children. I mean, I meet a lot of, in the work I do and traveling, I meet a lot of young people, and I see them and their hearts and what they're doing and the story they're bringing forth together. So I know it will go on, but, at what cost to all of us? And it reminds me how much power one person can have. And that ultimately, each of us is a power source, every one of us. And so we have to figure out, what it is that we were put here to do, what we need to take care of, and develop that and go to work doing that.
When you think of exemplars who have withstood the overreach of power, who are some particular images or stories that you carry with you to fuel your own courage?
Yeah, stories of courage. I think it's everyday people. I mean, certainly I've always liked the story of Gandhi, but then I've always had, everybody's a human being, and what always comes to mind now is once I heard the story of him sleeping with nubile young women, I guess to test him, that always rings a little funny, but people are people. I mean, it also makes a story. There would be no story without challenges. Be no story without conflict. You just have maybe a skin with no bones or a heart, So, just watching ordinary people. I still remember her, and I don't remember her name, but this young Navajo woman when I was a student. And I'd be working so hard, and I went to work, and I had a full load, and I had 2 kids, and pretty much on my own. And then I'd feel a little ragged, and then she would come into a meeting, and she was just well put together with, I think she had 3 or 4 about 4 or 5 little children with her, all very well behaved, and she was like me, taking a full load. And I was just thinking, I always honored her, it's like, wow, this is, what it takes. I honor what it would take for her to get up and cook and fix everything and get the kids ready and, all the things that you have to do to make a family. So much so that before I stopped painting and switched my major to creative writing, I was going to start working on a series of women warriors because the people that you see in history books are usually those picked out not by the community. Now, some of them are, and some of them are the community is proud of them, but I think about who would the community pick? Who do we see that no one else sees? And those are people, sometimes they go through incredible hardship. Maybe the family knows and no one else knows, but then they manage to get their high school diploma, or they manage to make it through college. They manage despite, having to take care of family members. And, there's all kinds of stories of people who have survived incredible things, and nobody knows their story.
In your memoir, Crazy Brave, you say, I am seven generations from Monawi, who with the rest of the Red Stick contingent fought Andrew Jackson at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in what is now known as Alabama. Our tribe was removed unlawfully from our homelands. 7 generations can live under one roof. That sense of time brings history close, within breathing distance. I call it ancestor time. Everything is a living being, even time, even words. That passage struck me with a particular poignance because I had read this right before going home to Alabama a month ago. And my grandparents lived in Dadeville, which is just very close by where the Battle of Horseshoe Bend happened. And I was raised in Talladega, which there was another battle with Andrew Jackson that is memorialized in a little historical marker there in downtown Talladega. And those 2 battles in Talladega and at Horseshoe Bend, where all of my people are from and where I was from, then it led, of course, to the displacement of your people on the Trail of Tears. And so having read that and then being home and making a special stop by the historical marker, I don't know. I didn't know what to do with that other than to be aware of the sad and poignant way in which all of a sudden I found this connection with you. And yet I'm on a different, it's my heritage that profited off of the injustice to your heritage. And I don't know that even that I have a question other than I simply wanted to acknowledge that and see, maybe my question is, I know you use this notion of story field, but maybe that seems like this sort of awareness that we're all a part of this shared story. We find ourselves at different places in the story, but it certainly draws us in a profound way, I think, to see one another's humanity, at least at a minimum, in a way that we might not otherwise. But I don't know, any thoughts?
That's the complexity. And actually, I need to correct that in the book. I'm actually 6 generations. I really wanted it to be 7 because of the 7 generations. And I did think it was 7, but it's not. It's 6 generations. And Manawi, An American Sunrise, that book deals directly with that history and how Manawi and his family, he had different wives, and one family was killed at Horseshoe Bend, the women, the children. And I'm descended from Betsy Kozer. And he went to, on the trail, I have the emancipation records in that book, Bending Our Way. And it has a lot of those emancipation officer records and about him and the Fish Pond people, Fish Pond Miko and his family traveling together from Talladega, Alabama to on the Trail of Tears. And how Manawi liked to party. I mean, I like those human things, but those human moments. But yeah, I mean, what do you do with that? I mean, I think about, I downloaded a biography of Andrew Jackson because I'm trying to figure something out and trying to understand the history and to understand why. I mean, it's people making people inhuman is the problem. So that you can't sit and talk and reason with each other or and do so without an assumption that because of your culture or something like skin color or any of those things gives your opinion more value or makes you more of an authority or allows you to dominate. And that was the whole point of democracy in a way, and the way it was set up based on native cultures, the Iroquois and the Muscogee, it was about consensus and talking respectfully and listening. Listening is a big part of it, one-on-one and with groups. And then there's a breakdown. I think guns enter into it in a big way. Gun power, authority, assumption of authority based on religion, which has been a major destructor in this whole in the world, in terms of forcing your way onto other people, and so on. So I think about it. I think about the contradictions even of how we wind up here, you and me, or how when I had a position at University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and my husband and I went all over that part of the world. We found houses that some of our family members had lived in. And I remember going to what they said was Sequoia's cabin, the birthplace, not far from Knoxville, and going in there and discovered that Sequoia fought with Andrew Jackson at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. He fought against Muscogee Creek people. A lot of and it was, I think about what was going on then, and just people trying to survive, seeing the onslaught, not knowing, and other people, settlers coming in, many of them just trying to have a little piece of land or a home from a place where they had nothing, or there was no chance of them at all. They were starving or no chance to have anything. And it's complex. But then I think the simplicity is that, you look at it, you don't go in, and it would be like somebody in a spaceship coming in and saying, okay, you guys, we're going to tear down your churches or your places, and you've got to live like us. And marching your kids into their schools and trying to make them like them. I mean, it's all, and yet here we are as two people, and that's important. And I think that's going back to the original question, is where poetry comes in. To be able to sing together or to come to an understanding in a way that's beyond the small human mind.
You mentioned religion and the role of religion, and certainly the destruction of the imposition of religion. What was your conception, experience of religion or God or faith as a child, and how has that developed or changed?
Oh man, I don't want to get in trouble talking about religion. Yeah. Because I already have made enemies because of a few things I've said, like saying that it's been a major cause of conflict and wars all over the world. If I go back to my earliest consciousness, and I can remember even being an infant, and even before, but to the earliest consciousness, I was in awe of, for me, creation was being an incredible awe. And I found that outside, and I found it with the trees, and I found it usually not where human beings were, but I would see it in acts of kindness and acts of, I think, deeply spiritually aware as a child. And I think maybe most children are. And then they're drummed in, they get these ideas, or they learn things. And I think it was around, by the time you go to school, you're being perhaps mined in a way, going back to extraction economy or extraction. you're being mined or your energy, or we start to lose track. I mean, little children are very creative. They don't judge. They're not, by nature, they don't judge. But they do they repeat what they see. And yet, I think people still come in as who they are, even as they come up through families. And my mom she called herself a Methodist. And my grandfather, Henry Marcy Harjo, the one who had the oil company, was, he and my grandmother, Katie Manawi, met at a boarding school. I think they had been orphaned after the trail, and church. I mean, that's all church. But I think our people, Muscogee people are very spiritually minded people, and I think they use then religion. They would make it fit the culture in a way, and you see that with the churches at the Pueblo, in the Pueblos, where there's a native Catholicism and so on. And that's sort of what Muscogee people did, in the way that some of the Muscogee churches, where they arranged them somewhat like the ceremonial ground. But it does. I think it's something, it was in conflict resolution for holy beings, something about that. What is it? We were a raccoon deer, and they said Christianity would divide the people, and it did. But then we gave Jesus a Muscogee name. Something, I write it poetically in there because, and then I address it too, and I don't want to read that poem, but, and so it's difficult to talk about. I got involved in an evangelical church because they were coming to the school and putting up, right before summer, notices about Vacation Bible School, and they had candy attached to it. So, of course, I was hooked, and went, and I loved the stories, and I loved the innate spirituality of it. I did. But what I had a very hard time with, and what eventually made me leave, was that this is the only way. And I thought, that doesn't make sense. I wasn't about to talk to anybody. I didn't talk to anybody. But, this is the only way. And there was a lot of racism. There were people who wouldn't talk to me. I'm light-skinned, but there were people, because I was a Native, would not sit with me, would not talk to me. But there were other people who were wonderful and treated me like a relative. And I just went there because it became a kind of refuge. And again, the spirituality beneath all of the, the judgment and the racism, the racism that was there. So I left that, but, it's, really I'd like to think of, it's about, for me, my understanding, it's about this incredible love beyond belief, and then we humans get that, and we don't believe it, or we make stories, we're who we are. We get in here and make stories and get ourselves into a lot of trouble.
You said that in many cases you experience this awe and are moved by kindness, awe at the creation or in nature, or moved by kindness. And I'm just wondering, do you have any particular, what particular pictures come to mind of vision of nature or acts of kindness that especially move you in that way?
Man, let's see. I'd have to think about that.
Yeah.
I know I've had mentors. I guess this is the way I can approach it, is that I've had many mentors I've had incredible mentors in poetry and healing arts and in just family. And I think for somebody to give of themselves, even teachers, I see that a lot in teachers. And I experienced it with teachers, like in 6th grade, where she didn't have to say anything. I would come into the classroom, and she could be pretty. I liked the way she ran the classroom because she didn't put up with anything. She didn't put up with crap, and some teachers would put up with all kinds of stuff and waste everybody's time. But I liked the way she just held the discipline in that classroom, and we learned. And I would come in, and I was going through some rough stuff, and she could see that. But there was something in her manner. She didn't have to, I didn't want her pity. I didn't need pity. But I just felt that she saw me. And to me, that's some of the most subtle kindness, perhaps, is to look at somebody and see them, even in a moment, even somebody on the street, is just to see them. Say, okay, you have a story, and your story is just as important as mine, and here we are in this moment, so I honor you. And I honor that you're part of me in this story. And then walking, and I've had people, do that with me, people I don't know, people when I've been in situations where I thought I couldn't get by, and just a moment. I remember the writer Meredith LeSueur. Had 2 kids, and I had met her not long before, and I was just starting to write poetry. And one day, I get a cash in the mail, that I absolutely needed for food, and there it was, and she didn't say, "Look, I sent you," she just, I think, that's part of it. It's just reaching out and to people, not necessarily people that you know. You don't have to know people. And I like watching it in children, innately in children. I've seen it in animals too.
How have you seen it in animals?
I don't know. I say that. Maybe I've watched too many videos. Reels. I always like that Reels video where that swan is feeding the fish. I don't know if you've seen that.
No, I haven't.
Yeah, it's cool. Yeah. I love those kinds of things.
So going back to what you said there about being seen and being seen as someone who has a story, I would love it. It's kind of, as we close, if you would do an experiment with us, and if you were to perhaps tell Joy Harjo's story in brief fashion, what would be the key moves or highlights of who you are?
Oh, man. I would think of myself, I would say that she was I actually wrote something. I said that my mother was the sun and I was the moon. I just wrote that in something. And I was observant and fierce and dark, dark in my countenance. And then it took a lot of trials and dealing with dragons and struggles, and then at some point there's a blooming with words, words and music, and they start to bloom, and they start, and that plant makes friends with plants and all over the world, something like that. That's not very good.
Well, I think that it's quite lovely, and I would say we're grateful for the way in which you have blossomed and bloomed with words, and the way in which you have sought to bear witness to history, and bear witness to peace, and bear witness to reconciliation. And
I have one story actually about a plant.
Please.
We think of animals, but it's a story in my book, Girl Warrior. And somebody gave me an African violet plant. I never had one, but it bloomed and bloomed and bloomed, and you have to water it a certain way. And I left, but that plant and I had a nice relationship, and I had to leave in I left instructions for watering, but I didn't for that plant. They watered it. And by the time I got back, the roots had started rotting. And I tried to make the plant come back, and it tried. But it always gave me flowers. It bloomed constantly. And so I told it, I said, I really miss your flowers. And right before it died, it gave me one flower. And I think, okay, I know it heard me. I had that relationship, and life is in all things. There's communication with all things, even planets and our body, organs in our bodies, and our, of course, with each other. Sometimes there's communication, sometimes not. There's resonances, but that's a story. I think of, that plant hardly had anything left, but it used some of its last energy to give me a flower. Yeah.
Well, thank you for the flowers that you've given us. Been talking to Joy Harjo, 3-term U.S. poet laureate. Thank you, Joy, so much for your work, and thank you so much for your time with us today.
Thank you.
Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Carriet Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, and Audrey Griffith. Our theme song was composed by Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.